The desert wind carried sand like frozen needles across the North African plateau. In a command tent, hastily erected beneath camouflage netting, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel stood over a topographical map, his fingers tracing the thin red lines that marked American positions. Outside, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and his staff officers stamped their boots against the cold. Rommel's eyes were bloodshot from months of retreat, supply shortages, and the gnawing realization that the war he had once dominated was slipping through his fingers like the Saharan sand itself. He had read the intelligence reports. The Americans were green, untested. Their Second Corps had landed in Morocco and Algeria only months before, and their commanders, he had been told, were cautious, conventional, products of a soft nation grown fat on abundance and naive idealism. Rommel expected them to fight like the British, methodical, predictable, bound by doctrine. He expected them to be afraid. What Rommel did not expect, what none of the German high command expected, was George S. Patton, Jr. To understand why the German generals failed to comprehend Patton, one must first understand the lens through which they viewed war itself. The German officer corps was the product of centuries of Prussian military tradition, a culture built on discipline, hierarchy, and the scientific study of war. Their doctrine was forged in the campaigns of Frederick the Great, refined in the Franco-Prussian War, and perfected in the early Blitzkrieg victories of 1939 and 1940. War, to them, was chess, calculated, rational, governed by rules. Commanders were expected to be cold, analytical, their emotions buried beneath layers of professional detachment. Patton was none of these things. Born in 1885 to a wealthy California family steeped in Southern military tradition, Patton was a romantic in an age of industrialized killing. He believed in reincarnation, convinced he had fought as a Roman legionnaire, a knight at Crécy, a cavalryman under Napoleon. He wept openly at the graves of his soldiers. He read the Bible and ancient Greek poetry. He carried ivory-handled revolvers, not for practicality, but for symbolism, because he understood that war was not merely a science, but a performance, a contest of wills, where psychology mattered as much as logistics. The Germans studied Patton's record and saw contradictions. They noted his aggressive tactics in the Meuse-Argonne during World War I, but also his obsession with tanks at a time when horse cavalry still dominated military thinking. They observed his flamboyant uniforms, his profane speeches, his public displays of temper, and they dismissed him as theatrical, undisciplined, perhaps even unstable. In their reports, German intelligence officers used words like unberechenbar, unpredictable, but they did not understand that unpredictability itself could be a weapon. What they failed to grasp was that Patton's theatricality was not a flaw, but a feature, a deliberate strategy to inspire his own men and unsettle his enemies. Where German commanders relied on the mechanical efficiency of their staff systems, Patton understood that soldiers fight not for abstract strategic objectives, but for leaders they believe in, for causes that stir their blood. He drove himself to the front lines in open vehicles, exposing himself to fire, not out of recklessness, but because he knew his presence would electrify his troops. He designed his image, the polished helmet, the riding crop, the profanity-laced orations, to create a myth, and myths, he understood, could move armies. In February 1943, Rommel launched Operation Frühlingswind, a desperate counteroffensive aimed at driving the Americans back to the sea. At Kasserine Pass, his Africa Corps smashed through the green American defenses with terrifying efficiency. American tanks burned. American infantrymen retreated in disorder. For a moment, it seemed the German assessment had been correct. The Americans were soft, their generals timid.
But Rommel's victory was incomplete. He had expected the Americans to collapse entirely, to sue for terms, to abandon North Africa. Instead, they regrouped. and in March, command of 2nd Corps was given to Patton. What followed was not a conventional military reorganization, but a transformation of spirit. Patton arrived at the American headquarters in Jebel Kuf and immediately began reshaping the army in his image. He instituted strict uniform regulations, not out of vanity, but to restore discipline and pride. He ordered every soldier to wear a helmet and tie at all times, even under fire. He personally fined officers $50 for minor infractions. His message was clear: sloppiness in appearance meant sloppiness in combat, and sloppiness got men killed. But more than discipline, Patton brought aggression. In staff meetings, he pounded tables and shouted down officers who counseled caution. "We shall attack and attack until we are exhausted, and then we shall attack again," he told his commanders. It was not posturing, it was doctrine. Patton had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, Sherman, and Jackson, and he had concluded that the essence of victory was not firepower or numbers, but relentless forward momentum. The army that attacked imposed its will. The army that defended surrendered the initiative. The Germans, monitoring American radio traffic and interrogating prisoners, noted the change but misinterpreted it. They saw Patton's aggressive maneuvers as reckless, his rapid advances as tactically unsound. Rommel himself wrote in his diary that the Americans under Patton fought with more enthusiasm than skill, a characteristically Prussian dismissal that mistook audacity for incompetence. What Rommel and his peers failed to understand was that Patton's aggression was not reckless, but calculated, grounded in a sophisticated understanding of mobile warfare that in many ways anticipated the future of mechanized combat. Patton had spent the interwar years studying tank doctrine, visiting European armies, corresponding with British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart. He understood that tanks were not merely infantry support weapons, but instruments of operational shock, capable of penetrating deep into enemy rear areas, disrupting supply lines, and creating psychological paralysis. In late March 1943, Patton launched a series of probing attacks against the German defenses in southern Tunisia. These were not frontal assaults, but slashing, indirect maneuvers designed to exploit weaknesses and force the enemy to react. At El Guettar, Patton's forces repelled a German counterattack, destroying 50 tanks and inflicting heavy casualties. It was the first clear American victory against the Wehrmacht, and it sent a message: the amateurs were learning fast. But even in victory, the Germans misread Patton. They attributed his success to American material superiority, the endless supply of tanks, trucks, artillery shells, and fuel that poured from the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. And there was truth in this. American industry in 1943 was producing war material at a scale that defied comprehension. Every month, American factories turned out thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of artillery shells. German soldiers in Tunisia joked bitterly that the Americans could afford to fight badly because they could always replace their losses. Yet this explanation was incomplete, even comforting, because it allowed the Germans to preserve their sense of superiority. If the Americans won, it was only because they had more resources, not because they were better soldiers or more innovative commanders. This narrative persisted throughout the war, a psychological defense mechanism that prevented the German high command from confronting a more unsettling truth: that American commanders like Patton were adapting faster, learning from mistakes, and synthesizing new forms of warfare that the Germans, for all their vaunted professionalism, could not counter. The symbol that haunted German soldiers in Tunisia and later in Sicily, France, and Germany itself was not a weapon but a material object that represented American abundance in its purest form: the steel helmet. Unlike the German Stahlhelm, which was handcrafted and carefully fitted, the American M1 helmet was mass-produced, stamped out in millions in factories that never stopped. German prisoners of war would later describe their shock at seeing American supply dumps stretching for miles, mountains of helmets stacked alongside crates of ammunition, rations, gasoline, spare parts. One captured Wehrmacht officer wrote in his diary, "They throw away in a day than we receive in a month."
The helmet became a symbol of the gulf between the two nations, not just in material wealth, but in the ideologies that wealth represented. The German army was lean, efficient, built for short, decisive campaigns. The American army was profligate, wasteful by German standards, but that waste was itself a form of power, a demonstration that America could afford to fight a long war, could absorb losses and continue advancing. By the time Patton left North Africa for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the German High Command had begun to take him seriously. Yet they still did not understand him. They noted his speed. His 7th Army raced across Sicily in just 38 days, covering ground faster than any army since Napoleon. They noted his use of deception, his feints and diversions that consistently wrong-footed German defenders. But they attributed these successes to luck, to the weakness of Italian forces, to the overwhelming American material advantage. The idea that Patton possessed a genuinely innovative military mind, one that synthesized the best of European theory with a uniquely American pragmatism, remained beyond their conceptual framework. This intellectual blindness was not unique to the Germans. Within the American command structure itself, Patton was often misunderstood, his talents resented or underestimated by more conventional officers. General Omar Bradley, Patton's peer and eventual superior, admired his combat effectiveness, but distrusted his theatricality and worried about his political unreliability. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, valued Patton as a weapon to be deployed in crisis, but kept him on a short leash, twice relieving him of command for public relations disasters. What these men understood, but the Germans did not, was that Patton's genius was inseparable from his flaws, that his aggression and egotism were not disorders to be managed, but the fuel that drove his operational brilliance. The definitive test of Patton's methods came in August 1944, during the breakout from Normandy. After weeks of grinding combat in the hedgerows of northern France, Allied forces had finally ruptured the German defensive line at Avranches. Eisenhower's plan called for a methodical advance, securing flanks, consolidating supply lines, ensuring that German forces could not counterattack. Patton, given command of the newly activated Third Army, had other ideas. On August 1, 1944, Patton's tanks roared through the Avranches Gap and fanned out across Brittany and central France in one of the most spectacular advances of the war. In 30 days, the Third Army covered 400 miles, liberated dozens of towns, captured thousands of prisoners, and reached the outskirts of Paris. German commanders, accustomed to the methodical pace of British and Canadian operations, were stunned. They had no reserves in place, no defensive plans for such a rapid advance. Patton's columns moved so fast that they frequently outran their own supply lines, capturing German fuel depots and using enemy gasoline to keep moving. German generals studying the campaign maps in their headquarters could not reconcile what they were seeing with their understanding of logistics and operational art. Armies were not supposed to move that fast. The textbooks said it was impossible. Yet Patton did it, not by ignoring logistics, but by redefining them. He understood that in mobile warfare, speed itself was a form of supply, that capturing enemy depots could sustain an advance, that the psychological impact of rapid movement, the dislocation it caused in enemy planning, was worth the risk of outrunning one's own fuel trucks. In their post-war memoirs, German commanders would struggle to explain Patton. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg doctrine, acknowledged Patton's skill, but attributed it to American resources.
Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt called him "that cowboy general," a term meant to be dismissive, but which inadvertently captured something essential about Patton's character. He was, in a sense, a cowboy, a man of action over theory, of instinct over calculation, of personal courage over bureaucratic caution. These qualities the Prussian military tradition had systematically bred out of its officer corps, and their absence made it impossible for German generals to predict or counter him. The ideological dimension of this failure was profound. The German military elite believed in hierarchy, in the subjugation of individual will to the collective mission. Patton embodied the opposite, the American ideal of the individual as hero, the leader who bends the organization to his vision rather than submitting to its rules. This was not chaos, but a different kind of order, one rooted in democratic culture where authority had to be earned through results, where leaders led from the front because their subordinates could, in theory, question their decisions. Patton's soldiers followed him not because they had to, but because he convinced them, through personal example, through shared hardship, through the force of his personality, that he would lead them to victory.
The symbol that recurred throughout Patton's campaigns was not the helmet, but the watch. Patton was obsessed with time, with moving faster than the enemy could react. He wore multiple watches, checked them constantly, berated subordinates for delays measured in minutes. In his headquarters, clocks covered the walls. His operation orders were infamous for their precision. Attacks would begin not at dawn or mid-morning, but at 06:03 hours, coordinated to the second across entire army fronts. This obsession was not mere eccentricity, but a manifestation of his core philosophy, that war was a race, and the side that acted faster, decided faster, moved faster would impose its will on the slower opponent. The Germans, for all their professional excellence, were slower. Their decision-making was hierarchical, requiring approvals that moved up and down the chain of command. Their logistics were efficient but inflexible, optimized for set-piece battles rather than fluid campaigns. Their intelligence systems were thorough but ponderous, analyzing data when Patton was already 2 steps ahead. By the time German staff officers had formulated a response to Patton's last move, he had already made his next one. In December 1944, when German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower summoned his commanders to an emergency conference. The situation was dire. German panzers had torn a 50-mile gap in the American lines and were driving toward the Meuse River. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a cautious withdrawal to shorten the Allied line. Other generals advocated for a defensive posture, allowing the German offensive to exhaust itself. Patton stood and announced that he could disengage the Third Army from its current offensive in the Saar, wheel it 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration within 72 hours. The room fell silent. What Patton proposed was considered impossible by conventional military standards. Disengaging an army in contact with the enemy, moving it 100 miles in winter conditions, and launching a coordinated attack, all within 3 days. It was the kind of maneuver that took weeks to plan under normal circumstances. Eisenhower, who knew Patton's capabilities, gave the order. 72 hours later, on December 22nd, the Third Army attacked north toward Bastogne. Within days, Patton's forces had relieved the besieged 101st Airborne Division and blunted the German offensive. It was a logistical and operational masterpiece, proof that Patton's methods, speed, aggression, personal leadership, could achieve results that conventional doctrine deemed impossible. The Germans never understood how he did it. In their post-war analyses, they attributed the Ardennes failure to Hitler's meddling, to poor weather, to lack of fuel. They could not accept that they had been out-generaled, that an American commander had moved faster and thought more clearly than the descendants of von Clausewitz and von Moltke. This intellectual failure was rooted in something deeper than military doctrine. It was ideological. The German officer corps, for all its technical proficiency, was trapped in a worldview that could not accommodate the possibility that a democratic society might produce superior military leaders.
They believed that war was the province of aristocratic warriors, that true military genius required the kind of cultural refinement and historical education available only to a narrow elite. Patton, with his cowboy persona and American directness, did not fit their model of what a great general should be. Yet Patton was, in fact, deeply educated. He had studied classical warfare as intensely as any German staff officer, had read Xenophon and Caesar in their original languages, had absorbed the campaigns of Frederick and Napoleon. But he wore this learning lightly, subordinating theory to practice, always asking not what the textbook said, but what would work. This pragmatism, this willingness to discard doctrine in favor of results, was fundamentally American, and it gave him a flexibility that his German counterparts lacked. As the war ground towards its conclusion in early 1945, Patton's Third Army drove deep into Germany, crossing the Rhine, liberating concentration camps, racing toward Czechoslovakia. German soldiers surrendering by the tens of thousands reported that they feared Patton's forces more than any other Allied army, not because the Americans were more brutal, though Patton's reputation for swift, aggressive action was well earned, but because they were unpredictable, fast, and seemingly everywhere at once. In their final assessments, German generals would concede Patton's tactical skill, but continued to insist that the American victory was primarily a function of material superiority. This was true, but incomplete. America's industrial might was indeed decisive, but that might had to be wielded, had to be translated from factory output into battlefield victory. Patton was one of the men who did that translation, who understood that tanks and trucks and artillery shells were not enough, that they had to be animated by will, driven by speed, employed with imagination.
The failure to understand Patton was ultimately a failure to understand America itself. The German High Command saw the United States as a nation of merchants and farmers, materially wealthy but spiritually soft, capable of building tanks but not of producing warriors. They could not grasp that American democracy, for all its messy egalitarianism, was capable of generating leaders like Patton, men who combined technical proficiency with personal charisma, who led not through inherited authority, but through demonstrated competence and force of will. The watch on Patton's wrist ticked forward, each second a reminder that time was the ultimate resource, that the army that wasted it would lose. The Germans wasted time on hierarchies, on chains of command, on deference to authority. Patton wasted nothing. He moved, attacked, won. In the end, Rommel's assessment of the Americans had been correct in one sense. They were enthusiastic, but he had been catastrophically wrong in dismissing that enthusiasm as a weakness. Enthusiasm, channeled through leaders like Patton, became a devastating weapon, a force that German professionalism could catalog but never counter. When the war ended, Patton stood in the ruins of the Third Reich and looked back across the campaigns that had taken him from the deserts of North Africa to the heart of Europe. He had moved faster and fought harder than any commander of his generation, had vindicated his belief that war was not a science, but an art, not a calculation, but a contest of wills. The Germans had never understood him because they could not see past their own assumptions, could not imagine that a democracy might produce genius, that abundance might be forged into audacity, that a cowboy could outthink a field marshal. The lesson of Patton, written in the rubble of a continent and the graveyards of two armies, was this: that war is not fought by doctrines or traditions, but by men, and that the nation which unleashes its most creative, most daring, most human warriors will prevail, not because it is richer, though it may be, but because it is freer, and freedom makes men bold. The wind still blows across the North African desert, carrying sand over the rusted remains of tanks and the weathered markers of graves. Rommel is gone, Patton is gone, but the question they posed to each other across the battlefield remains: can genius be taught, or must it be unleashed? The Germans believed the former, the Americans proved the latter, and in that difference lay the outcome of the war.